be with those who are online today. If they are online because of distance, we ask that you bless them and keep with them, stay with them. If they are online because of illness, we ask that you heal them and through the wonders of this body with which we have been blessed, and through the skills that you place in the hands of the doctors and the nurses and the healthcare providers wherever they are. We ask that you be with with those who are traveling and on the road, and keep them safe as well. We know that there are many who are traveling, and we ask that you keep them safe and bring them back at the next appointed time. We ask that you be with all those who are suffering losses and suffering illnesses. We ask that you be with our military personnel, be with our first responders, be with our doctors and health professionals, be with our leaders, Father, and we ask for the strength to initiate that revival which might bring this nation back to your accords. We ask for the continued guidance and continued strength. We ask that you forgive us of our sins and find our prayers worthy of your acceptation. We offer these prayers in the name of your precious Son. Amen. Okay, so we're in Ezra. Of course, last week we kind of did the introduction, so I'm not really gonna spend a lot of time there. We noticed that he was a scribe prior to the exile, and one of those functions that he served, not secretary, but took over a lot of the functions that had been fulfilled by the priests. Of course, the scribes were also Levites, and so we look at the book and we look at Ezra. Ezra and Nehemiah had been counted as one volume by the Jews, and then it was broken out as it was translated. And so the author of the book, we get indications that he was present at the transactions because of the detail that's involved, that he was present and part of this. Ezra, Nehemiah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi took place between the years 536 BC and 430 BC, which is the period between the time of the conquering of the first taking away of Assyria, and up through the finish completion of the construction of the temple and reestablishment of the city of Jerusalem. And we look at the outline of First Ezra, and we look at the first caravan of captives that returned, that the worship renewed, and the temples begun. I'm gonna double down on that here in just a second. We look at the outline of Ezra, the second division, which basically is the commission. Ezra has the commission to renew the law, and about his caravan and his journey, which is separate from the first caravan, the first journey, which was under Zerubbabel. Okay, and then we look at how he deals with the problem of unlawful marriages. And I will point something out to you, that those unlawful marriages were problematic even before they left Babylon, or Persia, Medo-Persia, as it was then called. Okay, and so we want to note that it is a priestly account of the restoration of the nation, and that it emphasizes their establishment as a kingdom of priests, as a holy nation, which was to continue to walk in the law, something they had not done because of the and which is why they were exiled in the first place. Okay, I'm not going to go over the restoration. We talked about that, and we talked about the part that Cyrus played, and talked about the fact that God not only protected Cyrus, but through Daniel and then through Jeremiah, told him, or through Jeremiah and then through Daniel, as much as told him that he was the person he had selected, and it so impressed him that he, although he might not have taken a full, been fully converted, he at least accepted that the God of Israel had plans in store for him, and that he was doing what he was supposed to do. Okay, I'm not going to talk too much about that. And this is where Isaiah spoke about Cyrus and named him by name 150 years before he came on the scene. Okay, and I told you the story that the Greek historians give about how Cyrus was protected from Astyages by confusing by confusing the king Astyages, who was Cyrus's grandfather, confusing him and preventing him from killing him as a child. Recall that his mother was invited to come from the southern part of the kingdom. Once the viziers basically said that his daughter would have a child who would take his place as king, and he was threatened by that. So his plan was he invited her, held her prisoner till the baby was born, and then took the baby and gave it to his marshal to get rid of. Well, his marshal didn't do that. His marshal actually took him back and gave him to his huntsman, his woodsman, the one who was in charge of his forests, and who had just lost a child whose son had been born stillborn at about the same time. Okay, and so they took him for their own and claimed that his dead child was the baby Cyrus. As it turns out, that didn't work out. But Cyrus was like 12 years old when he got himself in trouble for ordering the roughing up of a nobleman. Okay, remember he was being raised as a commoner, and that was against the law in Persia, and so he got called on the mat for that. And King Astyages recognized him in the discourse that he had with him, and thought that something was afoot. And when he pressed the woodsman further, the woodsman admitted that this was someone who the marshal had given him. Well, marshal was dealt with in a very harsh way, according to the Greek historians. Astyages actually murdered the son of the Lord Marshal, and literally served him up on a platter, like John the Baptist. Okay, and so what's that? Oh, okay. Cyrus. This is what I was telling you. The viziers, that he went back and asked the viziers. He said that because basically the whole event, the whole reason it came to his attention was because Cyrus, as a child, they were playing king. They were playing like Dungeons and Dragons, and he was the king. And this rich kid said, well, I want to be king, so I'm not going to do what you say. And so the king said, beat him up. And he did. They did. So now he's called on the mat. The king recognizes his grandson, figures it out. And the king then went back to his wise men, his viziers, and said, now remember the other dream, remember the other premonition. Do I kill him now that everybody knows he's here and knows who he is? How do I deal with this? His viziers said, well, he's already been a king in make-believe land. So we believe that the prophecy has been fulfilled already, and he's okay. He's not a threat to you. So the king let him go back to Persia, to southern Persia, to be with his mother and his father, who was a prince of southern Persia. Lord Marshal was from that area as well. Lord Marshal basically became Cyrus's mentor, taught him all about military tactics and everything. And Lord Marshal was with him when they marched back in. Now, Cyrus defeated Astyages, King Astyages, to consolidate the empire. He defeated his grandfather, and his grandfather died in battle. And that's how Cyrus became the ruler of the Persian Empire, which of course then marched in and took Babylon. That's kind of a broad brushstroke, but does that help you? Cyrus was taken under the wing of the man who was treated so badly by the King Astyages, his grandfather. And Cyrus literally did take over the kingdom and replace him again. The viziers were wrong. That was his rightful place. Yes, he did. Well, remember that there were three kingdoms. One was relatively minor, but the first kingdom was the kingdom of which Astyages was the king. The second kingdom was the southern kingdom, and there was I would call it a civil war, but it was a war of consolidation to consolidate the empire. And so Cyrus took over the empire. Okay. No, I do not know how old he was. I believe he was fairly, I would say probably in his 40s or so. It's interesting to note that as soon as he had fulfilled that prophecy, and I note the prophecy who says that whose right hand I have holden. In another place, he says that he has confused the viziers and the advisors, where he has confused them and turned their thoughts as God did. So God was looking out for him in multiple ways until he passed this edict, which we will read about as we open that first chapter of Cyrus. And it's interesting to note that shortly after that, he was involved in a civil war, and a relatively minor wound resulted in eventually in his death. So he was protected until he did God's will, but after that, he was kind of on his own at that point. All right. And it's interesting to note that after Darius the second, the king that the Palestinians petitioned, that the Samaritans petitioned, had to go back into the records and find this edict of Cyrus. And we'll see that in Ezra as well, I believe. So first off, we see chapter 1. Chapter 1 basically summarized the Lord moves to end his exile. Okay. Now, I might have a few things that might be in order. Remember that the exile had been set for 70 years and it had expired according to the formula that the Lord had prescribed to repay the Sabbath of the land. If we go to Daniel 9, verses 1 and 2, somebody look up Daniel 9, verse 1 and 2, and someone else look up Leviticus 25 and then and Leviticus 26 for me. Can you see that? Leviticus 25 verses 2 through 4 and Leviticus 26 verses 33 through 35. I think you'll see that the formula is there, and that formula basically, if you recall, that the Jews had failed to, of course, they had done a lot of other things that got them exiled, but the Jews had failed to observe the Sabbaths that God had ordained. Remember that God said that every 7 years you plant your crops for the 6th year, and the 7th year you let it lie fallow. And I'll protect you during that period of time. Go, you got it? You got Leviticus? If you would, you got Daniel 9? All right. Judy, if you'll read Daniel 9, 1 and 2.
In the first year of Darius, the son of Ahasuerus, of Caesar, which was made king over the realm of the Chaldeans, in the first year of his reign, Daniel understood by the book the number of years whereof the word of the Lord came through Jeremiah the prophet, that he would accomplish 70 years in the desolation of Jerusalem.
70 years in the desolation of Jerusalem. Okay, so there's that. Kathy, you go ahead and you say you've got Leviticus. Go ahead and read Leviticus for me, please.
25, 2 through 4. Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, when ye come into the land which I give you, then shall the land keep a Sabbath unto the Lord. 6 years thou shalt sow thy field, and 6 years thou shalt prune thy vineyard, and gather in the fruit thereof. But in the 7th year shall be a Sabbath of rest unto the land, a Sabbath for the Lord. Thou shalt neither sow thy field nor prune thy vineyard.
That's called letting the land lie fallow in modern terminology, and that's one of those ways that it is renewed. You let the land set for a year until it replenishes itself, and then you can go back and plant your crops. So you see, that's not just good farming practice. That's ordered by God. All right. Now you look at Leviticus 26 verses 33 through 35 for me.
And I will scatter you among the heathen, and will draw out a sword after you, and your land shall be desolate, and your cities waste. Then shall the land enjoy her Sabbath as long as it lieth desolate, and ye be in your enemy's land. Even then shall the land rest and enjoy her Sabbath.
There you go. So now I want you to understand that these other passages say basically the same thing, and Jeremiah is probably the passage that was quoted to Cyrus by probably Ezra, who then convinced him that he was chosen of God to return the Jews to Judea. Okay, and I know that it is speculated, it is postulated that the ones that were returned were the original. The ones that returned were the original inhabitants of Judea in the first place. Remember that there had been a civil war, and that 10 of those tribes had gone one way, and 2 of those tribes had gone another. And they inhabited Judea, and of course they had enough good kings that God stayed His hand against them until the last evil king, who literally ended up killing Isaiah. Okay. Now, as we look at this, we'll point out that the Jews had, of their period of time, the last 490 years before their exile, the Jews had ignored the Sabbaths of the land. Okay. So you wonder why. Now, that's not saying that God exiled them just for that, but that's how God applied the formula for letting the land rot. God restored the Sabbaths to the land which He had given them. Now, that's an indication that that land was not theirs, that God had given them that land, but that they were stewards of that land. And so we see that God had told them He was doing that, but as God does, remember that that God had told the Jews originally, the children of Israel, that they were to have no king but Him. And He said, but you're going to select a king, and I tell you that these kings are going to do things which are going to oppress you, and you're going to regret it. All right. He said the same thing to them. He said, you will observe these Sabbath laws until you don't, and then you're going to regret it. And so He predicted that this would happen and said that He would take them out of the land for that period of time. And so God determined the length of their exile. What was it? 1 Sabbath year out of every 7. 490 years they failed to observe the Sabbath. So the quick math says that's 70 years. And so God restored the Sabbaths at the same time that He restored their fidelity to His law, and broke them of idol worship. Okay, and by that I mean sacrificing to other gods. All right. So Isaiah had prophesied the end of the exile, and he had named the instrument of that delivery and had moved him to free the Jews. And Cyrus' decree authorized the return to Palestinian. That's the first 4 verses we're going to read. And then Cyrus returned the sacred vessels of the temple to Israel, which Nebuchadnezzar had looted and stored in his treasury, and which the last king of Babylon profaned, remember, by getting hauling all those vessels out and using them to have a party, basically. And that's when Daniel uttered that prophecy as a result of the disembodied hand that was writing on the wall and interpreting for King Belshazzar, I think his name was. Okay, and he is who the man whom Cyrus confronted in his rapid invasion of Babylon at that time. And they didn't even know that the Persians were in their land until they were standing in front of them in the palace, and that king lost his life that night. All right. Let me see. Let's go ahead, and I want to go ahead and open, if you will, the first 3 verses, if you would please. Make it the first 4 verses.
Now in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom, and put it also in writing, saying, thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord God of heaven hath given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and He hath charged me to build Him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah, who is there among you of all the people. His God be with him, and let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and build the house of the Lord God of Israel. He is the God which is in Jerusalem. And whosoever remaineth in any place where he sojourneth, that the men of his place help him with silver and with gold and with goods and with beasts, beside the freewill offering for the house of God that is in Jerusalem.
Okay, now that verse 4 is going to play prominently when the Samaritans challenged the building of the temple, and the ruler, the leader, the satrap who is in charge of that area, orders a temporary halt to the temple, and then sends word back to literally to I think it's the grandson or great nephew of Cyrus, who is and that would be Darius, who is going to make that call for them on this. And so they go back into the records and they find it, and we'll find that passage, verse 4, will play prominently in that. But I want to note a couple of things here. You look back where you're looking at Ezra, right? Directly of the last verses of 2 Chronicles 36 are essentially the same thing as the first verses of Ezra. And of course, they're right next to each other. If you've got that, if you would read verses 22 and 23 of, actually read verse 21 through 23 of 2 Chronicles 36 for me.
To fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land had enjoyed her Sabbaths. For as long as she lay desolate, she kept Sabbath, to fulfill 70 years. Now in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Lord spoken by the mouth of Jeremiah might be accomplished, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom, and put it also in writing, saying, Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, all the kingdoms of the earth hath the Lord God of heaven given me, and he hath charged me to build him a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah, who is there among you of all his people. The Lord his God be with him, and let him go up.
Okay, so now that's Jeremiah being quoted to probably being quoted to Cyrus from by Ezra. But I note also that that God had opened up this prophecy with Isaiah at that point. And I'll take you back to Isaiah 44, and I'm going to read 44 through I think it's 45:4. And I know that this is not strictly in Ezra, but it's so closely related that we really need to consider this as we go. So I'll take you to Isaiah 44:24. You're welcome to read along with me there if you would like. So we see that Isaiah's prophecy from the Lord is this: Thus saith the Lord thy Redeemer, and he that formed thee. Now he's not talking to the people. This is a message for Cyrus from God through Isaiah. Okay, thus saith the Lord thy Redeemer, and he that formed thee from the womb. I am the Lord that maketh all things, that stretcheth forth the heavens alone, that spreadeth abroad the earth by myself, that frustrateth the tokens of liars, and maketh diviners mad, and turneth wise men backward, and maketh their knowledge foolish. Remember I talked about the wise men and how they misinterpreted their prophecies and said, well, Cyrus is no threat to you already because he's already been a king in fantasy land. And so he can go home. Turned out that wasn't the case, okay? So they spoke the truth, but they didn't speak the truth. They said what God wanted them to say to make that happen, okay? That confirmeth the word of his servant, and performeth the counsel of his messengers, that saith to Jerusalem, thou shalt be inhabited, and to the cities of Jerusalem, of Judea, ye shall be built, and I will raise up the decayed places thereof, that saith to the deep, be dry, and I will dry up thy rivers, that saith of Cyrus, he is my shepherd, and shall perform all my pleasure, even saying to Jerusalem, thou shalt be built, and to the temple the foundation shall be laid. Thus saith the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have holden. Remember I told you, the right hand, that's the position standing here holding the right hand. On the left hand side, that's the position of protection. That's where the Lord Marshal would stand when he stood next to the king. The queen would be on the other side, and the queen's right hand the king would hold. Okay, all right. So he says, then let me see if I can find it there. He says, I will go before thee. I will loose the loins of kings to open before him the two-leaved gates, and the gates shall not be shut. I will go before thee and make the crooked places straight. I will break in pieces the gates of brass and cut in sunder the bars of iron. And I will give thee treasures of darkness and hidden riches of secret places, that thou mayest know that I, the Lord, which call thee by thy name, am the God of Israel, the God of Israel. For Jacob my servant's sake, and for Israel mine elect, I have even called thee by thy name. I have surnamed thee, said he will be Cyrus, though thou hast not known me. Okay? And then he says, I am the Lord, and there is none else. There is no God beside me. I girded thee, though thou hast not known me, that they may know from the rising of the sun and from the west that there is none beside me. I am the Lord, and there is none else. Obviously, Cyrus took that to heart, because remember that in his proclamation, he said, the God, Lord God of Israel, he is the God. In other words, he is God. So Cyrus is here admitting, and this language is recorded originally in the official language of the realm. There was, of course, the languages that they spoke, but there was a language in which all the legal documents were recorded. And this is originally recorded in a legal document in the language, the Chaldean language, which was accepted as the original language of the land. So he admits that God, the God of Israel, is the one God here. And so obviously he has experienced at least some kind of a conversion here at the hands of presumably Ezra. We don't know for sure. It just says that he was made known of these things. I'm thinking that it was Ezra. Ezra was was in an important position in his palace. Okay, so then he says, as they go, then he starts to talk about those who rose up to go. So go ahead and read, if you would, starting in verse 5, and go ahead and go to verse 8.
Then rose up the chief of the fathers of Judah and Benjamin, and the priests and the Levites, with all them whose spirit God had raised, to go up to build a house of the Lord which is in Jerusalem. And all they that were about them strengthened their hands with vessels of silver, with gold, with goods, and with beasts, and with precious things, beside all that was willingly offered. And Cyrus the king brought forth the vessels of the house of the Lord, which Nebuchadnezzar had brought forth out of Jerusalem, and had put them in the house of his gods. Even those did Cyrus king of Persia bring forth by the hand of Merthatherat the treasurer, and numbered them unto Sheshbazzar the prince of Judah.
Okay, so now Sheshbazzar is probably Zerubbabel. Okay. There is also a theory that Sheshbazzar was someone who was appointed to oversee the contingent of Persians, Medo-Persians, who were sent along with the Jews to assist them in their journey. But it's quite probable. Recall the Babylonians' penchant for taking the noblemen and the priests of the nation, in this particular case of Judea, and turning them to service, neutering them and putting them in the palace, if you will. Of course, we see that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, probably Daniel, possibly some of these mentioned here, who were serving and as Jews, serving in the capacity of administrators because of their abilities and because of Cyrus's conversion. Okay, so the best theory, the best consensus is that we're talking about Zerubbabel, who led that first contingent, out of Medo-Persia, formerly Babylon, and back out of exile and back to Judea. Note that they did not go, you'll see the caravans that are mentioned. Remember that caravans are designed to go straight across the desert. So they did not go all the way up through the Fertile Crescent and back down again. They went directly into Judea, across the desert and straight into Judea. All right. Now, then we talk about the numbers. He talks about the numbers of, in this particular case, the treasure. Go ahead and read for me through verse 11, if you would, please.
And this is the number of them: 30 charges of gold, 1,000 charges of silver, 29 knives, 30 basons of gold, silver basons of a second sort, 410, and other vessels 1,000. All the vessels of gold and of silver were 5,400. All these did Sheshbazzar bring up with them of the captivity that were brought up from Babylon unto Jerusalem.
Okay, so now what we're talking about here is that which was taken from the temple treasury. All these things. When we talk about the 29, the 29 knives there in verse 9 and 20 knives, those were the ceremonial knives that were used for the dismembering of the sacrifices during the temple worship. Okay, so these were all things that were laid together for the use and maintenance of the temple itself. Now, why was all of this still here? Well, more than likely, it's because the Babylonians were of that heathen frame of mind that when you took the accoutrements of the temple of a nation's god, you essentially held that god prisoner. Okay, and so it was a way of controlling them. They had to have an idol. They didn't have the ark. The ark was not there at that point. They did not have the Ark of the Covenant, but they had all these things, and so they put them there as a way, basically, of saying, your God is now our captive. And so did they spend it? No. They wanted to look at that and say that their God was greater than the God of the Jews. And when they looked at that in the treasury, that reminded them of that. So that material was there and held and however that reason that it was held, it was available for them to take back. Not only that, remember that as Esther had secured through the Persian king previously the right to defend themselves against, and we'll talk about that as we get to the book of Esther, the right to defend themselves. As they did that, they also took the spoils of those defensive measures against those Babylonians who were, or those Persians who were going to oppress them, who were going to wipe them out. Remember, that was the plan originally, was to get the king to pass a law that allowed all the noblemen of Persia to wipe out the Jews, literally wipe out the Jews. That didn't happen. Esther is the account of how and why that did not happen. Okay, and so we'll get to that. And what we'll see is God's hand at work again, as always, in protecting them. Now we get to there's a lot of there's a lot of things going on here in verse 2, but most of it is administrative. So we're going to cover a few key passages. And so if you would please, chapter 2, verse 1, if you will.
Mm-hmm. Now these are the children of the province that went up out of the captivity of those which had been carried away, whom Nebuchadnezzar the king of Babylon had carried away unto Babylon, and came again unto Jerusalem and Judah, everyone unto his city.
Everyone unto his city. So that's how they open this. And then they go in with a very detailed accounting of all those who left with Zerubbabel in this first caravan, and it's quite lengthy, and the names are quite tedious in many cases. But we talk about those that came with Zerubbabel. We're talking about his family. Okay, Jeshua, Nehemiah, Sariah, Reliah, Mordecai, Bilshan, Mispar, Bigvai, Rehum. But you see where we're going with this? The number of men and the number of the men of the people of Israel. And then he starts talking about the families of the tribes, and predominantly these are the tribes of Judah and the half tribe of, and I'm trying to remember, and I just had it, Benjamin, Judah and Benjamin. Okay, now I'm not going to go through these verse after verse after verse of how many of each of these family leaders came, but when you get to verse 61, there's something that's important here, and that is the children of the priests. And there's an event indicated in here that we need to take consideration of. All right, go ahead and read, starting in verse 61, please.
And the children of the priests, the children of Habath, the children of Koz, the children of Barzillai, which took a wife of the daughters of Barzillai, the Gileadite, and was called after their name. These sought their register among those that were reckoned by genealogy, but they were not found. Therefore were they as polluted, but put from the priesthood.
And so you have the descendants of Barzillai the Gileadite, who was not Jewish, okay, and his family had basically married in, and so the determination was made that they were not of the lineage of Judah. They were not of the lineage of the priesthood, I should say. They were not the Levites. Okay, and so as a result of that, they had to be purged from the records, and they were put out of the priesthood. They were allowed to go, but they were not allowed to be part of the priesthood at that point. Okay, so that's important to note, that there was a weaning process that was going on, a thinning process that was going on there, a perfection process. Now, the big thing that we need to remember is that we read. I'm going to let you read from verse 64 to 70, and that's where we'll stop.
All right. The whole congregation together was 42,303, beside their servants and their maids, of whom there were 7,337. And there were among them 200 singing men and singing women. Their horses were 736, their mules 245, their camels 435, their asses 6,720. And some of the chief of the fathers, when they came up to the house of the Lord which is at Jerusalem, offered freely for the house of God to set it up in his place. They gave after their ability unto the treasure of the work 61,000 drams of gold, and 5,000 pounds of silver, and 100 priests' garments. So the priests and the Levites, and some of the people, and the singers, and the porters, and the Nethinims dwelt in their cities, and all Israel in their cities.
Okay, so that is the point where they have completed their journey. They're sitting there, they're collecting everything, and note that they have not actually started the work on this, but that's where we'll get to the fact that they will establish the worship, and then they will start to build the temple. And if you ask about all the wealth that was used, that was kept in the treasury, all those things that were spoken of in verse 9 through verse 11 of Ezra 1, you're going to find out what they did with those funds. Not only those funds, but those which these leaders, these chieftains, were able to pull together out of their own coffers to contribute to the work that was at hand. And so as we get to chapter 3, we're going to start to talk about reestablishing the worship and rebuilding the temple and setting things up so that could be done. Are there any questions? Yes, sir. Singing at one time? Yeah. It's interesting to note, though, that they had what became cantors, but they had singers. In one of the passages, which I kind of glossed over, which we jumped over, they talk about the children who were the families who were chosen as singers, and I don't see it in here, but they had singers who were detailed to do just exactly that. But yes, there was singing and there was rejoicing, but you'll note that there was also weeping. One would ask, why are they weeping? Some were probably weeping for joy. Some were probably weeping out of sorrow. We'll explore that in chapters 3 and 4. Are there any other questions?
Yes, bro. So, like when we're talking about the 70 years and the temple being neglected in the 70 years, but now so no one was there to occupy the temple and
There
all
was no temple. Before that last carrying away,
So okay,
the
temple,
Babylonians, there were basically two revolts, and
okay,
each revolt was a subsequent carrying away. But the last time, they not only carried away everybody who was anybody,
Mhm.
but they also leveled Solomon's temple. They
They leveled
razed
the
it to the
temple.
ground.
Oh,
So there was no temple anymore.
they tore the whole
They
temple
tore it
down.
all down.
Okay,
There
now.
wasn't even a foundation.
So they had to rebuild the temple.
So that was what they were doing. They were rebuilding that temple and establishing it. Of course,
Okay.
it would be a scaled down version of Solomon's temple. Remember that
Yeah.
Solomon wasn't the only person who was involved in putting that together. Remember that
Mhm.
David assembled all the materials that Solomon needed while he was still king.
Yeah,
God said, "You cannot build it."
that's right. He had
And
blood on his
David,
hand. David had blood on his hand.
because he had blood on his hands, and David decided that he might not be able to build it, but he was able to bring the materials
Mhm.
together. And so he had enough materials accumulated that they were able to build the temple. And then everything that Solomon did after that was burnishing, was putting extra things on
Right.
that temple and adding to it and increasing its
Right.
splendor. And he
I got you.
did a very
And
elaborate job
while
of
they
that.
while they was in captivity in Babylon, they didn't observe the Sabbath at all. While
They observed their Sabbaths.
they still
okay,
observed the Sabbath.
but they didn't have a temple.
Okay,
What they did have was the synagogues
had a
spread
synagogue.
throughout. And that's
Okay.
why, for instance, the scribes took over the priestly function
Yeah.
because they were scattered as far apart as they were. Remember that
Yeah.
the high priest, their job was to serve in the temple at Jerusalem,
Mhm.
but there was no temple in Jerusalem.
Mhm.
So all of that priesthood was spread out.
Okay.
And they were spread far and wide, so far
Yeah.
that the Levites were spread thin. And so
Mhm.
those who would have been scribes and not
Yeah.
priests
Okay.
served that function and became primarily teachers of the word. So
Mhm.
they any sacrifice that they had was probably minimal.
Okay.
Remember that they were being constrained by Babylonian law and ultimately by Persian law to
Mhm.
do those things. That's
Right.
That's how Daniel
Right.
ended up in the lion's den, that he
Yes.
was forbidden from worshiping.
Right.
And they caught him at it, and he
Mhm.
worshiped anyway, and he didn't try to hide it, and they caught him, and that's how that
Right.
happened.
Right.
Okay.
That's right.
Did that answer
Yeah,
your question there?
yeah.
Okay. Any other questions? Thank you for the questions. Thank you very much for joining us for this study, and we will. I'm going to mark it now so I don't forget about it. If I don't tear the page of my Bible in the process, we'll take up chapter 3 next Sunday, Lord willing, and we'll be back at the top of the hour for our regular service. Thank you.